Hi everyone, I want you all to look at this picture here, and I hope you can see something familiar when you look at this. If you can recognize this guy, that's very good. You should recognize him because this is General Yamashita. He was the Japanese general in charge of the Japanese forces who were invading Singapore from late 1941 onwards. This is General Percival, the British general. Basically, this took place at the Old Ford factory, a place where you should have gone to before. This was the venue of the negotiations, whereby at the end of them, General Percival surrendered Singapore to the Japanese, and so the Japanese took control of Singapore on 15th February 1942. And as you can see here, okay, the Japanese troops went on some sort of like a victory march through the streets of Singapore. If you can recognize this building, this actually is Chimes, located at Bras Basah Road. And so they were marching to show the people of Singapore that the British were out and the Japanese were in. Now, you may be wondering, why am I going through all of this? Because this is Sec 2 history. But basically, we're looking at this because now we want to find out what was it that prompted the Japanese to launch all their aggression and invasions to the extent that Singapore fell to the Japanese and was under Japanese control for a full 3.5 years. Sorry, my maths is not very good. Okay, so basically we are looking at excuse me, reasons for the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific. Now, we'll look at it in two different segments, the long-term factors and the short-term factors. For this video, we'll look specifically at the long-term factors, which means factors or reasons leading to the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific, which started off much earlier on. Okay, the outbreak of war itself in the Asia Pacific, we could say, was from the late 1930s. So officially, World War II started with the Asia Pacific with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. However, long before that, already from the start of the 20th century, which means the early 1900s, there already were things which were going on, and even before that, which led to the Japanese invasion, the Japanese launching of World War II in the Asia Pacific. Okay, so of course you already would have learnt about the German launch of World War II in Europe. So this is the Japanese. This is what happened on the other side of the world, okay, in the Asia Pacific, and instead of Germany, the main aggressor, so-called the bad guy, was Japan. Okay, so without any further ado, let's look at the long-term factors. If we look at the long-term factors, you can see basically we start off by looking at the background of Japan, how Japan was like, what's the context, and then we'll move on to two other factors, Japan's expansionist foreign policy, and then Japan's worsening relations with the USA. Okay, but first things first, let's look at the context of Japan. Now, Japan's cultural past, what was it like? Okay, excuse me, let me just move over there. Okay, so in earlier times, okay, Japan was ruled under a period known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. Okay, just a disclaimer, there are quite a few names which may be a bit difficult for you. Don't worry if you don't remember them, but you just need to know the gist of what's going on here. Okay, so under the Tokugawa Shogunate, here were some features of it. Firstly, as you can see there was a suspicion of foreign influences. All right, in other words, the Japanese, they thought they were suspicious of anything which was not Japanese. Okay, and this later would have had an effect on how the Japanese viewed foreigners such as the Westerners, okay, whom they later got into some conflict with. Okay. Secondly, the shogun, or the military dictator, was seen as the supreme ruler. Okay, so in other words, military rule. What's the implication of this? Okay, in Japan, there was great respect for the Japanese military, which meant that people were open to having strong and influential military leaders in politics. Okay, they did not have a problem with having a military leadership in charge not just of their military, but in charge of the country as a whole. Okay, and this would have implications on later on why the Japanese military had so much power in eventually launching its Japanese aggression in Asia Pacific. Excuse me. Okay, linked to that, there was something called the honor-based samurai code. Okay, to cut a long story short, this meant that surrender was seen as especially dishonorable to the Japanese people. In other words, surrender was the worst thing they could do. So in the event of fighting, if they were going to lose, they would rather fight to the death than surrender. Okay, and this would have implications on how the Japanese fought later on during World War II. Okay, another feature, the caste system. Basically, this meant that there was a certain hierarchy. Certain groups of people in Japan were more powerful and were more respected. Their views were more highly held than others. Okay, and so this respect for authority would have implications later on how in Japan what certain people said would not be questioned. Okay, and definitely go ahead of it. Go ahead. People would agree with it and go ahead with it. Okay. And finally, the influence of something called Confucianism. Okay, this is a way of thinking which basically places a lot of emphasis on loyalty and duty. So similar to what I said earlier, okay, because people would be loyal to their rulers, okay, they would listen to them, okay, they would not dare to disobey them. Okay, if only some of you students nowadays were the same way. Okay, listen to the authority figures because we know best. Okay, this is basically what is going on over here. Okay, and duty. So if people felt they had a duty to listen, duty to play their role for the country, they would do so. Okay, so this was during the Tokugawa Shogunate. Later on, okay, there was another event called the Meiji Restoration. Yes, the same Meiji as your milk and whatever other products you may be familiar with, food products you may be familiar with. Okay, anyway, under this Meiji Restoration, Europe, the emperor was restored as the most powerful political figure in Japan. Okay, previously he was not. It was the shogun, but under the Meiji Restoration, the emperor was restored as the most powerful political figure in Japan. Okay, however, he was closely supported by the military. Okay, and why was this done? Okay, the aim. Okay, what did he want to do? His aim was to strengthen Japan through modernization and industrialization in order to match the Western powers. Okay, so basically he felt that Japan was not as powerful as the Western powers, and he wanted Japan to catch up. Okay, so as a result of these reforms, which were put into place under the overall leadership of the emperor, Japan's military and economy were greatly strengthened. Okay, so as you can see here, this is the background of how things were like in Japan, and we will see later as to what happens over here. This background, how things were like in Japan, had an impact on why Japan would launch further aggression, leading to the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific. Alright.